have enough waters for everybody. Let's do them on Austin height, right? So like if you sit in. Okay, perfect. Then let's do that. Yeah, yeah. No, no, that's what I. Oh.
That mic's on. have a quorum in a minute. Oh, yeah. I call the Committee on the Budget to order. I'd like to welcome all the returning members and the new members to the committee to the 116th Congress. Of course, recognize my distinguished ranking member, Mr. Womack. I'm honored to serve on the committee with you again, and I just want to say for the record that, as I've told you personally, no one could have been more gracious and classier and helpful in making the transition from the majority to the minority than you and your staff have been, and we all greatly appreciate that.
Thank you. It works both ways.
Thanks.
And I appreciate it myself.
And I am sure that the respectful attitude that you put, that you advanced and furthered as chairman will continue in this Congress as well. Before I recognize you for your opening statement, I would like to welcome and introduce the Democratic members of the committee. It's a group with a wide array of talent, and I'm honored to have them serve on this committee. After the organizational meeting concludes, the committee will begin its scheduled hearing. We have some returning members, a few new members as well. I would like to take a moment to introduce our new Democratic members, as well as those returning who did not sit on the committee last year. I'll start by welcoming members returning to the Budget Committee. We have Rosa DeLauro, who served in the 111th Congress. She serves on the Appropriations Committee and is chairwoman of the Subcommittee on Labor, Health, and Human Services, Education, and Related Agencies. Lloyd Doggett from Texas, who served in the 113th Congress, serves on the Ways and Means Committee and is chairman of the Health Subcommittee. David Price is not here yet, but from North Carolina, served in the 107th Congress. He currently serves on the Appropriations Committee and is chairman of the Subcommittee on Transportation and Housing and Urban Development and Related Agencies. Dan Kildee served in the 113th Congress. Dan from Michigan serves on the Ways and Means Committee. And Bobby Scott, who served on the committee in the 111th Congress as chairman of the Education and Labor Committee. Now I'd like to recognize members who are not new to the House, but to the Budget Committee. We have Jimmy Panetta of California, serves on the Ways and Means Committee. It's not here yet. And Stephen Horsford, who also serves on the Ways and Means Committee. And now we have two members who are new to the Budget Committee and to Congress. Joe Morelli comes from New York, comes to us with a long history of public service after more than 27 years as a member of the New York State Assembly. He also serves on the Rules Committee. And we have Ilhan Omar, who is from Minnesota, a coalition builder and community leader. Before coming to Congress, she served as the Assistant Minority Leader in the Minnesota House. Ms. Omar also sits on the Foreign Affairs Committee. And we also have Congresswoman Jayapal from Washington, who is a returning member of the committee. It's now my privilege to introduce the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Womack, for his opening remarks.
I thank the chairman, and at the outset, I would like to congratulate you on your new role. I look forward to working with you and continuing this committee's tradition of collegial debate. When I took the chairman's role last year, the first thing I did was to reach out to the ranking member, and I found there a person that, unlike the rhetoric in Washington, would have you believe that it's all shirts and skins and us and them and we and they, and I didn't find that at all with Mr. Yarmuth. I have a great deal of respect for him as a member, and somebody that I can go to and we can work out our differences from time to time, and we'll continue in that tradition. So I look forward to a healthy debate in the issues before the Budget Committee and the great working relationship that we have already established, and I wish you well. I'm envious, however, of your gavel. For those that have not seen it, he does come from a bourbon state, and it looks a lot like a bourbon barrel. I have inspected said gavel and have not found a plug, so I think it's a pretty solid piece of wood and not containing any spirits. Let me also introduce the members of the minority on the Budget Committee. Rob Woodall from the 7th District of Georgia, who is not here just yet. He also serves on the Rules and Transportation and Infrastructure Committees. Bill Johnson will serve as the vice ranking member on the Budget Committee. He is out of the 6th District of Ohio and also serves on Energy and Commerce. Jason Smith, 8th District of Missouri, who also serves on Ways and Means. Bill Flores, 17th District of Texas, who also serves on Energy and Commerce and was previously on the Budget Committee. George Holding is here today, 2nd District of North Carolina, also a Ways and Means Committee member. Chris Stewart, the 2nd District of Utah, also serves on the Committee on Appropriations and the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. We welcome Chris to the dais. Ralph Norman from the 5th District of South Carolina also serves on Oversight and Reform, Space Science and Technology. And then we are blessed to have 6 really wonderful new members of Congress. I hesitate to call them freshmen because it suggests that they don't have the kind of experience or whatever that's necessary to do this kind of work. But boy, the backgrounds on these individuals is pretty special, and they will make an immediate impact on our committee. First of all, Chip Roy, an attorney from the 21st District of Texas, also serves on Oversight and Reform and Veterans Affairs. Chip, welcome. Dan Muser, a businessman from the 9th District of Pennsylvania, also serves on Ed and Labor and Veterans Affairs. William Timmons, an attorney, 4th District of South Carolina, also serves on Education and Labor. Dan Crenshaw, a retired Navy SEAL from the 2nd District of Texas, also serves on Homeland Security. Kevin Hearn, a businessman from the 1st District of Oklahoma, also serves on Natural Resources and Small Business. And we've got another mayor with us, Tim Burchett, former mayor of Knox County, Tennessee, in the 2nd District of Tennessee, also serves on Foreign Affairs and Small Business. Each and every one of these members brings a unique talent and a set of experiences to the Budget Committee, and I think they will prove invaluable to the work that we will do. Very excited to work with all of the members of the 116th Congress and know their experience and insights will be vital to helping address our nation's budgetary challenges. And with that, distinguished Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Womack, and welcome again to all the members of the committee on both sides. In the interest of time, if any other members have opening statements, you may submit those statements in writing for the record. Today, since a quorum is now present, we meet to adopt the committee's rules of procedure. The rules of the committee are essentially the rules that the committee operated under in the past under both Republican and Democratic majorities. The changes are largely technical in nature to conform to our committee rules, with the changes to the House rules that were adopted at the beginning of the 116th Congress. Do you have a motion?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that the chairman be authorized to declare a recess at any time.
Objection? Without objection, so ordered. So we will now proceed to consider the committee rules for adoption. A copy of the rules package has been distributed to each of you in advance. I'd like to begin by briefly reviewing the proposed rules package. The committee is required to adopt its rules of procedure under Clause 2 of House Rule 11. The rules package covers procedures relating to hearings, meetings, and reports. Most of the changes being made to that rules package reflect changes that were made to House rules earlier this month. Following House rules, the committee rules require a 3-day notice for meetings, excluding Saturdays, Sundays, or legal holidays, except when the House is in session. In accordance with House rules, our committee rules require that by March 1st of the first session of a Congress, we submit our oversight plan to the Committee on House Administration and Oversight and Reform. The oversight plan, which was developed with consultation with the ranking member, will be distributed to members this afternoon. I ask that members let staff know within 7 calendar days if they plan to submit additional views. Because the House rules now require member day hearings, we have codified this in our committee rules. It has been standard practice and the tradition of this committee, however, to hold a member day hearing on the budget. We have also made updates to reflect recent practice on how the committee operates and what is included in the committee report. The committee will now proceed to the consideration of the rules package. Without objection, the markup document is considered read and is open for amendment at any point. Are there any amendments? Hearing none, I now recognize the gentleman from New York for the purpose of offering the necessary motions to adopt the rules package.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee adopt the chairman's mark as the rules of procedure of the Committee on the Budget for the 116th Congress.
The question is on the motion offered by the gentleman from New York. All those in favor say aye. Opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The rules package is adopted and will be published in the Congressional Record and made available to members and the public on the committee's website. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. In keeping with past practice of the committee, I would like to make an announcement at this time. Because it is required by House rules, the committee rules contain a provision for the long disused practice of holding regular meetings on the second Wednesday of each month. Just as been done under previous Congresses, the committee is notified pursuant to Committee Rule 3 that all regular meetings for the 116th Congress are canceled. Members will be notified of additional and special meetings, as is our customary practice. I now ask unanimous consent that the committee be authorized to issue and print copies of the compilation of laws and rules relating to the congressional budget process. Without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make any necessary technical, conforming, or stylistic changes to the committee rules. Without objection, so ordered. That concludes the items of business on the agenda for the House Budget Committee's organizational meeting. Without objection, the organizational meeting is adjourned. Very easy. So we will now proceed immediately to the CBO budget. We're going to now proceed immediately to the CBO Budget and Economic Outlook hearing. We invite Dr. Hall to join us at the witness table. Yeah. Mhm. Okay, good. Welcome, Dr. Hall. And now you might yield myself 5 minutes for the opening statement. Oh, yes. Got to use the gavel. The hearing will come to order. Once again, welcome Director Hall. Thank you for joining us today and for all of the work you and everyone at CBO has done to update the baseline and economic outlook that will help guide our work this year. Since today was supposed to be the original day of the President's State of the Union address, let's start by acknowledging what should be obvious. The state of our union is unsustainable. Deficit projections over the next decade are unrivaled by any time in our nation's history save for World War II and the immediate aftermath of the Great Recession. Only this time, we weren't responding to an emergency. We created one. We're not in this situation because we were forced to make a tough choice to save the American people. No, we're facing this bleak fiscal reality because this president and the so-called fiscal conservatives in his party chose to squander our nation's wealth and solvency, to exacerbate record income inequality, to take resources from those in need so they could bolster the already wealthy with reckless tax cuts for millionaires and multinational corporations. Director Hall, you project a deficit this year that is $118 billion higher than last year. Average deficits over the next decade are projected to rise. The national debt is expected to reach 93% of GDP by 2029, before rising to an unprecedented 150% of GDP in 2049. This is despite the fact that the economy is undergoing the second longest expansion on record, 114 months of economic growth since 2009. Beginning under President Obama, we have had 99 months of uninterrupted job creation with unemployment falling to historic lows. But despite all this good news, our fiscal future is getting darker, not brighter. And the reason is clear. Just over a year ago, Congress passed a tax bill that showered the bulk of its benefits on corporations and the wealthy. My Republican colleagues didn't mind that our economy was healthy and the wealthy were doing just fine. They promised these tax cuts would trickle down to everyone else, unleashing miraculous economic growth and long overdue raises for workers. Even better, we would get all of this for free. The reality, a burst of welcome but very brief economic growth, followed by greater income inequality and exploding deficits. This outcome was not a surprise. Republicans have cut taxes and sent deficits soaring time and time again. But this time around, they hit a new record. Corporations took the tax cuts handed to them and bought back more than $1 trillion worth of their own stock. Not $1 trillion worth of worker bonuses or $1 trillion for raises when wages that have been stagnant for decades. Not even $1 trillion of new investment to expand business operations. In last year's report, CBO put the cost of the tax law at $1.9 trillion over 10 years, even after accounting for macroeconomic effects. Those numbers indicated that had we not passed it, the deficit outlook would have improved considerably, and the economy would likely be stronger. In fact, your report, Director Hall, confirmed that the tax cuts will reduce our economic growth rates by the end of the decade. This new forecast further confirms that inescapable reality. And we know how this story continues. My friends on the other side of the aisle will point to Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid as the culprits of the deficit. They will call for deep cuts to these and other vital programs in order to reduce the deficit they exploded. They will call for a balanced budget and ignore the role their tax cuts played in damaging the fiscal outlook. Make no mistake, as this and previous CBO reports have warned, we face serious challenges, serious fiscal challenges going forward. From caring for an aging population to mitigating the financial cost of a warming climate to making the investments we need to compete in a global economy and help American families succeed, the federal budget will be increasingly strained. These are the real problems that demand real solutions, and they will require a fair and responsible approach that includes revenue, that tackles the causes of high health care costs, and that improves efficiency of federal spending without harming seniors' retirement security or imposing more burdens on struggling families. Returning us to a sustainable fiscal trajectory will require smarter use of the nation's fiscal resources, and that is what I hope to do this year as chairman of the committee. I want our committee to help shine a bright spotlight on the reality of the situation we face, to fully vet the choices we have, and then set the stage to make the most responsible decisions as a Congress. Director Hall, thank you for helping us begin that conversation. I look forward to hearing your testimony, and I now yield to the ranking member for his opening statement.
I thank the gentleman. Good morning, and thanks to everyone for being here as we discuss the CBO's annual budget and economic outlook report. The goal of today's hearing is to analyze the CBO's latest baseline projections. These findings shed light on our nation's current fiscal challenges and guide us in mapping out a sustainable path for the future. This year's baseline brings daunting news, with the deficits projected to be $1.37 trillion by 2029 and debt reaching almost $34 trillion. While these numbers paint a sobering picture, it does not have to be America's future. Without question, we must create a new path forward. Mandatory spending is clearly driving up deficits and debt. Our nation's fiscal trajectory will remain unchanged if we don't address this sobering fact. And this is not only my deduction. CBO has stated in the past that revenue alone will not solve this problem. In his testimony last year, Director Hall said that increases in entitlement spending are the largest drivers of the increase in the deficit going forward. Unfortunately, it seems that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle don't recognize the severity of this problem, or if they do, I haven't seen their plan to fix it. So my question is pretty simple. What is your plan? I'm curious to learn, how can you reconcile your desire for astronomical spending increases with the need to address the issue of our ballooning national debt? Medicare for all, free college, and other initiatives touted by my Democrat colleagues will exacerbate our nation's fiscal problems. Rather than encouraging spending that will financially drive our country to the ground, Congress needs to face mandatory spending head on. Here is the reality. Our largest entitlement programs are facing insolvency. If we do nothing, they go under. Let me say that again. If we do nothing, if we maintain the status quo, they fail. Now, instead of fixing these programs, the new majority wants to expand them. This is irresponsible. We are facing a sovereign debt crisis that we know is coming. So again, I ask, what is your plan? I assume it is to raise taxes. I've heard some would like to raise individual rates to 70%, possibly increase the corporate rate from 21 to 28%. Is that the plan? To drastically increase taxes to pay for out-of-control spending? Let me be clear, we cannot tax our way out of this problem. Again, as CBO previously outlined, the biggest budget challenges lie in mandatory spending. If we don't address these drivers of debt, our march toward fiscal insolvency will not stop. My guess is that Director Hall will reiterate this point in this morning's hearing, as well as the fact that revenue isn't the solution. We need to work together to confront our growing debt burden and mandatory spending issues. So I ask one last time, do you think the deficit and debt projection released by the CBO is concerning? If you do, and I hope you do, what is your plan to address these issues? We have a moral obligation to future generations to get our fiscal house in order. I hope all committee members agree with that. I look forward to productive conversations today with Dr. Hall and my colleagues. Thank you, and with that I yield back to the distinguished chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Womack, and now it's my great honor to formally introduce once again Director Keith Hall of CBO. And Director Hall, the floor is yours. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Great, thank you. Chairman Yarmouth, Ranking Member Womack, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify about the Congressional Budget Office's most recent analysis of the outlook for the budget and the economy. I'd like to draw your attention to important information in that report about the amount of debt that the federal government will incur if we continue on the current budgetary path. I'm going to focus on 4 questions. The first question, what does CBO project? Let me highlight a few key numbers. At the end of 2018, the amount of debt held by the public was equal to 78% of gross domestic product. In CBO's projections, debt equals 93% of GDP by 2029 and about 150% of GDP in 30 years. Even at its highest point ever, just after World War II, debt was far less than that at just 106% of GDP. Second question, why does debt become so large in CBO's projections? Hopefully we use something new this time. You can see the answer in a summary of the report. We've given you a handout that has a visual summary. Hopefully you've got that in front of you. I'm going to refer to a couple of pictures. Apologize if you don't have it, or apologize for being difficult to see. This year we summarized it in some charts to try to be helpful. The figure on the bottom of the first page indicates why debt is growing. Federal spending and revenues both grow through 2029, yet the gap between them persists. Third question, what would happen if the economy grew more quickly? If GDP grew more quickly than it does in CBO's projections, revenues would increase more than spending would, and deficits would be smaller than projected. If economic growth was fast enough, deficits could actually shrink, and debt could stabilize or even fall as a percentage of GDP rather than continuing to grow. But such an outcome is unlikely. In 2018, the real growth rate of the economy, that is, growth with the effects of inflation removed, was 3.1%, the highest rate since 2005. Nevertheless, the deficit equaled 3.8% of GDP, and debt increased as a percentage of GDP. Furthermore, this year, the boost that recent tax legislation gave to business investment wanes in CBO's projections. Also, federal purchases dropped sharply under current law, starting in the 4th quarter of the year. As a result, economic growth is projected to slow in 2019. Over the longer term, output growth is projected to be lower than its long-term historical average because the working-age population is expected to grow more slowly than it did in the past. Real GDP grows by an average of 1.8% per year in CBO's 10-year projection. In short, the economy isn't likely to grow quickly enough to shrink the budget deficit. We have posted an interactive workbook on our website that lets you specify different economic scenarios and see the results. For example, if productivity growth turned out to be half a percentage point higher in every year than CBO projects, real GDP would grow by 2.4% per year over the coming decade instead of 1.8%. Deficits would average 3.7% of GDP instead of 4.4% of GDP. And debt would stabilize at roughly 80% of GDP by 2029. Such economic growth is possible, but it's not likely under current law in our assessment. CBO aims for its projections to be in the middle of the potential outcomes. So there is about the same chance that productivity growth could turn out to be half a percentage point lower than our projection. If that happens, real GDP growth could average 1.1% over the decade, and average deficits would be 5.2% of GDP. Debt would swell even more than it does in our current projections. Fourth question, what are the consequences of high and rising debt? If debt rose to the amounts that CBO projects, there would be troubling consequences. First, as interest rates continue to rise towards levels more typical than today's, federal spending on interest payments would increase, surpassing the entire amount of defense spending by 2025 in our projections, for example. Second, because federal borrowing reduces national savings over time, the nation's capital stock would ultimately be smaller, and productivity and total wages would be lower than would be the case if debt were smaller. Third, lawmakers would have less flexibility than otherwise to use tax and spend policies to respond to unexpected challenges. And fourth, the likelihood of a fiscal crisis in the United States would increase. In closing, I will emphasize that debt is on an unsustainable course in CBO's projections. To put it on a sustainable one, lawmakers will have to make significant changes to tax and spending policies. I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Director Hall. Appreciate your testimony. Pursuant to the policy that the ranking member and I actually used in the last Congress, we're both going to defer our questioning till after all of our members have been recognized. So, in light of that, I now recognize Mr. Khanna of California for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Yarmuth. Thank you, Director Hall, for your work and leadership. You're a distinguished economist, and I hope this Congress, everyone on both sides of the aisle will recognize that. Your report stated that the tax bill paid for about 30% of itself rather than 100% of itself, the tax bill that the Republicans passed last Congress. Would that suggest that any person who claims that the tax bill was going to pay for itself is wrong?
Well, obviously, projecting the future, you can be wrong. We can be wrong. We did a really careful analysis of the tax bill. We looked at research. We tried to base it on real data, real evidence, and our estimate did in fact show that the GDP benefits of the tax bill would increase revenues, but not enough to fully cover the bill. And as you said, it covers about 30% of the tax bill with respect to the deficit.
Yes, Director Hall, I'm not suggesting that you're wrong. I'm suggesting that people around the president, when they claim that this tax cut is going to pay for itself with a magical 4% or 5% growth, is it fair now that we can say that's economic nonsense?
Well, that's certainly a much bigger effect than we would estimate. It's well outside our forecast for the effects of the tax bill.
And one of the things, I mean, you're obviously a distinguished economist. I don't have a PhD, but as I understand it, I mean, the other side, they always talk about these deficits. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. This is a bit of a simplistic theory, but does this make economic sense? My understanding is that when Bill Clinton left the presidency, we had budget surpluses. And then three things happened. George Bush passed large tax cuts to the very wealthy. Trump passed large tax cuts to the very wealthy. And we got into a lot of foreign wars. If none of those three things had happened, would we still have budget surpluses?
The answer, I think, is no. We had really unexpectedly strong productivity growth during that time period. It was also a time period where the labor force was growing much quicker than in the past. That was because of women entering the labor force in greater numbers. So women's labor force participation sort of closed a gap at that time period. So we had much stronger labor force growth. We had unexpectedly big productivity. Neither of those things we're projecting going forward.
What do you think accounted for the strong labor force growth and productivity, other than you said women entering, what in the 1990s accounted for that?
Well, it wasn't women entering the labor force, it's also the baby boomers were in sort of their prime working ages during that time period. They still sort of are, but near the end. So the aging population at some point is going to start working against us. And so we see, for example, the labor force growing much slower now from this sort of demographic handicap going forward than happened in the late 1990s. Productivity is harder to project. You know, we see productivity heading back to somewhere near its normal range. Productivity has been very low the last 7 or 8 years, well, past decade, and it's been unexplainable. So we sort of have hopes in the productivity. It's just really hard to forecast productivity going forward.
You say that it wouldn't have wiped out all of the debt. Do you have a rough estimate if we didn't have the Bush tax cuts and Trump tax cuts and we didn't have a perpetual war in Afghanistan and Iraq, where how much money we would have saved?
We haven't done that sort of analysis.
Could we do that analysis?
We could look at it to get a feel for what difference it would make. A lot of things have changed since then as well, but we could take a look a little bit, give you some idea.
And my final question is about the shutdown. Your office estimated that it cost us about 0.2% the first year. We have the president going on television saying, well, we may have a shutdown again. And as someone who studied rational expectations and knows that investors and people take into account what we can expect, do you think when he does that, he's hurting confidence in the markets and hurting our economy because people don't know what to expect?
Well, when we did our estimate of the shutdown, we essentially didn't take that into account. We just looked at the effect of having the labor force idle for a while and then the add-on effects. But there are certainly other effects that you mentioned that we think we're getting stronger as the shutdown continued. And we think if the shutdown were to reoccur, continue for a while, we'd have some additional changes. You know, one of the things I think that's underappreciated is we'd have a higher risk for low probability, high cost events happening from security. We'd also have a lack of economic data that would, over time, could possibly lead to households and businesses holding back because of business confidence and because of consumer confidence. Federal permits and certifications, at some point that's going to start to have an effect perhaps on business investment. So there are these additional impacts that could occur if the shutdown recurs and it gets harder. Not to mention the really hard to measure, but the impact on the morale of the federal workforce. The ability to hire high quality workers could be impacted, and contractors. Contractors could actually cost us more money going forward.
The gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too look forward to serving with you and our colleagues to address our nation's spending and budget issues. Director Hall, you've previously told our committee here that tax increases will not come close to covering this nation's ballooning deficits, and it's clear from your newly released report that fact remains true even today. Yet, even in light of our inability to cover existing deficits, my Democratic colleagues are proposing massive new spending programs which would dramatically increase our future deficit. Take a look, if you would, at this series of charts behind me, which shows existing projected deficit down at the bottom in navy blue. Under your current baseline, if Congress was to do nothing for the next 10 years, that is, pass no laws, enact no new revenue or spending, the result would be a deficit of $1.43 trillion by fiscal year 2028. That's a lot of money. But it's dwarfed by the spending my Democrat colleagues would enact on top of it. For example, if we add expanded federal housing, the deficit would be $1.48 trillion in 2028, an increase of $50 billion from the baseline. Pile on the expanded opportunity credits, expansion of the earned income tax credit, and universal child care, and you're looking at a deficit of $1.92 trillion in 2028. Then we get to the really expensive part of their proposals. Free college for all, establishment of the LIFT credit, and a guaranteed federal job results in a deficit approximately $3 trillion by 2028. Finally, there's the pinnacle of budget-busting proposals, Medicare for All, which, with an estimated 2028 deficit of $6.78 trillion, required us to break the scale on the chart just to fit it all on one page. So my question to you, Director Hall, given that our revenues can't come close to covering our existing deficit, how then should we cover the deficit created by these new spending programs?
Well, I'll start with the track that CBO has always taken, is we don't make policy recommendations. But I will say that some pretty big changes would need to be made in tax policy or spending policy or both things.
Okay, like a good lawyer, then I'll rephrase my question.
Okay?
Under current law, can we cover these massive increases in spending with current law?
Under current
Given
law,
the assumptions that you made
Right.
in your proposal, in your report, would we come even close to covering these massive new spending programs and reduce the deficit?
no, under current law, without these programs, we're heading towards 93% of GDP, almost 100% of GDP in just 10 years. That's a pretty big challenge.
Yeah, and if I read your report correctly, I'd have to pull it out to look at the exact number, but by 2028, we're looking at a deficit that exceeds the highest peak in American history, which was right after World War II, correct? If we keep going in the direction that we're going.
Right, if we keep going, the highest peak was about 106%
Right.
of GDP, so it's not far from 93%.
And these are going to take them, these programs, if enacted, would take it so much higher than even that.
That is likely correct, although we'd have to look at the programs carefully to have
Okay.
an estimate.
Well, these are huge numbers, and they can, sound very abstract if you don't study this stuff every day. What are the concrete impacts of unsustainably increasing deficits on average Americans?
Well, one of the problems I would like to point out about the deficit is, I didn't highlight, is when it's occurring. Every time we go through a business cycle, I don't know if the graphs, if you all did get the graphs, but if you look at the debt, the cycle of the debt going up and down, after every recession, deficits and the debt go way up. And for example, in the Great Recession, debt was about 35% of GDP. When the Great Recession was over, it doubled. The debt doubled to about 75%. Right now, we're starting at 93%, right? So one of the big impacts is the risk going forward. If we go through another business cycle, have another recession, debt's going to be piled up on top of 93% debt. And that's going to get to a very high level. Another thing is the deficit, the borrowing, raises the cost of capital to the private sector. So the cost of capital goes up, the cost of business investment goes up, and there's less in the private sector. So productivity is lower, which means wages are lower. So it is a drag on productivity, it's a drag on wages, and it's a drag on GDP growth going forward. Those are two of the effects that I think are very straightforward and very clear.
Mr. Chairman, it sounds like all the work that we've done to increase wages for the American people, under these scenarios with this massive debt added on, we'd be depressing wages for the American people. And thank you for indulging the extra time. I yield back.
Absolutely. Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentlelady from Connecticut, Ms. DeLaurel. 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm delighted to be back on the Budget Committee, and welcome, Director Hall. It's always good to hear from you, and thank you for your thoughtfulness. My questions have to do with health care. New polling from Gallup suggests that the U.S. uninsured rate has risen to a 4-year high. At the same time, the Trump administration has repeatedly taken steps to sabotage our nation's healthcare system by weakening consumer protections and causing premiums to skyrocket. First question here is, how does CBO estimate the effects of this Trump administration sabotage on enrollment and spending in the marketplaces? I'll ask the follow-up, so, okay?
Okay.
CMS has also approved unlawful Medicaid work requirements in 7 states, despite mounting evidence that they cause significant harm. Arkansas, the first state to implement the work requirements, and the state reports that more than 18,000 people have lost coverage since they were implemented last June. That's about 23% of those subject to the requirement. What have you learned from the Arkansas experience that informs CBO's estimates of the number of people who will lose coverage due to Medicaid work requirements? So, enrollment, sabotage on enrollment and spending in the marketplace, the effects of, you're calculating those effects, and the Arkansas experience.
Let me start with the rule changes. We've, of course, have been studying the effects of the rule changes on healthcare coverage. As it turns out, some of the rule changes encourage enrollment, some discourage enrollment. So it's not really clear yet what the net effect's going to be. So we'll continue to sort of watch that effect. The information that you mentioned, the Gallup poll, is maybe an indication that coverage is going down, but let me just say that that's a private poll. It doesn't meet the usual standards of a federal government poll. It doesn't have the sample size and et cetera. So we wait for a poll that's done by the CDC to get those numbers. We do expect enrollment to drop, though. We expect it to drop in 2019 because of the elimination of the penalty in the individual mandate. So we wouldn't be surprised to see the enrollment start to drop. It's just too early to tell if it's really dropping in 2018 yet.
Mm-hmm. I would be very, very interested in following that up with you, because we look at the reduction and the cost-sharing payments, in addition to looking at the cutback in navigators, in enrollment times, in periods of time, thereby circumscribing the effort to be able to enroll people, to expand the opportunity. So I would love to have a continued dialogue. The Arkansas experience and Medicaid work requirements.
That's another one where we're watching the effect. We don't understand what the effect's going to be. So we'll watch the Arkansas experience. Every year we change our forecast of enrollment, and it'll be based on, in part, on that experience to see how that affects things. But of course, you're right in the sense that could change enrollment over time.
18,000 people have lost coverage already, so. Thank you. Let me just, on the shutdown, we talked about $11 billion short-term, $3 billion long-term. President has talked about another multi-week shutdown. And you know, the question I think has been asked about what that effect would be, but people are very, very uncertain at the moment, and they will not be spending in the next 3 weeks. So it's not a 5-week shutdown. It is going forward. And we also have created a climate of instability. And there's caution, whether it's businesses, et cetera, but I'm talking about individuals, caution about spending. Does that have an economic effect in your view? Because it goes beyond the federal workforce. And what kind of an economic effect in your view will that have? What is the economic effect?
Sure. Well, we certainly do think that those things would have an economic effect and would potentially slow down economic growth. We just weren't able to sort of measure that over just a 5-week period, but I do think that that's right, that those things were getting to be more important, and those things might affect economic growth more in the future. This increased uncertainty, to the degree it impacts household and business decisions, can slow down things. Reducing the efficiency of government is never a good thing. So I think all those things are things that have a potential impact. We just weren't able to really get our hands and measure those yet.
Will you be doing that?
If the shutdown recurs, we'd be happy to take a look at
Well,
that.
but you're looking at it's beyond 5 weeks.
Oh, I
You
see.
have a longer lasting period of uncertainty
Right.
and instability.
Right.
That is really captured in the public, and that the
Right.
data shows that in terms of people who rely on their paychecks. It's paycheck to paycheck.
Well, we will
Can
certainly
you
look
do
at the
this?
data and look to see if there's an effect there that's measurable. And we'll-
Okay, what I'd love to do is to be able to follow up with you on
Yeah, sure.
measurability. Thank you very much,
All right,
Mr. Chairman.
ladies,
Thank you for
time
your
has
indulgence.
expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Stewart, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the chairman and ranking member. As a new member of the committee representing appropriations, I'm honored to work with you and look forward to doing something productive, I hope. And Mr. Hall, you and I have several things in common. You have a PhD in economics. I took Econ 101 when I was a freshman. Actually, I have a degree in economics as well, although not an advanced degree. I read your computational partial equilibrium modeling. I don't know what that is. It sounds very cool, though. And one other thing we have in common is I think you're serious about the deficit and recognize the problem. You must feel like a lone man in the wilderness. And I'm sure that frustrates you because it is an enormous challenge. You know, I would argue it's, if not the most, it's one of the two most single greatest challenges facing our history, our future. It's the reason I ran in 2012 was because of our debt and our spending. And just very quickly, because I want to ask you a question, many of us have been kind of torn by this because I also work on Intel Committee. I'm a former Air Force pilot. I recognize national security is a concern, but I try to balance these two all the time. And it's interesting to my colleagues on the committee as well to hear how, you know, in just a few minutes we become tribal on this. You know, one side wants to blame tax cuts, the other side wants to blame spending. And at the end of the day, after all the politics and pontificating, the thing about economics is there's a number. And the number is pretty obvious, and you can also understand where that number came from. And I hope as a committee we can make serious and sincere efforts to try to address it. Because if we don't, then we're in a world of hurt, and we mess up our children's future. And there's just no question about that, which brings me to my question to you. And that is, I love the part of your written testimony here. What are the consequences of high debt? Because most Americans, if they don't understand what are the consequences, then they go, what difference does it make? I've been hearing about this for a long time. My life seems to be okay. What difference does it make? To go through them quickly, I want you to emphasize the last one. Increase interest payments, obvious. You've talked about that. Decrease in national savings, again, obvious how that impacts people. A decrease in flexibility of government, of Congress to address those problems, that should be important to all of us here. And then the fourth one is the likelihood of a fiscal crisis. I would like you, if you could, to give us kind of your worst case scenario. Because I know you have to work within the margins of we think it might be this, but tell us what happens, worst case scenario, what does this mean to people so that maybe we can get their attention and why we need to address it.
Well, sure. I think one of the things that we try to do is try to give you some feel for the uncertainty in our forecast. What are reasonable ranges for the outcomes? You know, for example, in the near term or the next 10 years, we see deficits being at something over 4%. Not hard to imagine deficits becoming 6.5%, getting larger, and that's without a recession going forward. That sort of effect would raise the debt after 10 years from 93% of GDP to a record. Could be 120% after just 10 years, something like that. I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but we try to do some of that, and that, again, that's without a fiscal crisis. We aren't forecasting a fiscal crisis, but the one thing we do know is the chances of that happening increase.
So I'm going to narrow your response if I could, because seeing your clock, you only have a few minutes. Talk to me about the word you just said, a fiscal crisis. Help people understand what that means. I'm not asking you, I know you're not projecting that.
Right.
I know, you know, heaven help us, we all want to avoid that. But if it isn't avoided, what does that mean to people? Talk to me about what that means to people.
The most important part of that is that the borrowing cost of the federal government goes up. Because of a lack of trust or whatever, if people start asking for a premium to lend the government money to run the government, interest rates could be much higher than we project at the moment. I'll give you for example, if interest rates, we think interest rates will go up to around 3.7%, 10-year treasuries. That's a pretty low historical level. If they went up a whole percentage point higher than that, we're talking about an extra $2 trillion in debt. If they go up an extra, a debt crisis would be more than a percentage point. If it's 2 percentage points higher, we're talking about $4 trillion in extra debt over the next 10 years. So the debt of the federal government gets to be really significant. And the basic punchline is, in that case, if you want to fix that, now you're talking about really draconian measures. You're talking about really decreasing spending or really increasing tax revenues, or both things, if you let this get out of hand.
Well, and we're out of time, so I'll just conclude with this. I appreciate your answer, although it frustrated me just a little, because most Americans, once again, well, what does that mean to me? I remember at the end of Jimmy Carter, and I'm not blaming Jimmy Carter, it just happened to be that was time, but we were borrowing money at 20% at that time. And that's the thing I want to talk about. This is what it means to you. Borrowing money at 20%, a 20% mortgage, an 18% mortgage, a 21% car loan. Those are the numbers we need to be talking about with people so they understand this matters to me. Thank you, sir.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Price.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also am happy to be back on the committee after a number of years away. Appreciate your leadership, Mr. Womack. Look forward to working with all of you. And thank you, Director, for a helpful report. I want to revisit your line of questioning with Mr. Khanna having to do with not so ancient history of the 1990s and those years when we saw budget surpluses and actually paid off something like $400 billion of the national debt, I believe. You talked about the factors that had produced a strong economy in those years, and of course that tends to address the budget deficit in a positive way, but those were also the years of comprehensive budget agreements. There were comprehensive agreements in 1990 and 1997 on a bipartisan basis. There was an important agreement in 93 with Democratic heavy lifting alone. And if Mr. Stewart's worried about tribalism, those were not tribal agreements. They were in the sense that they offended everybody. Something in those agreements for everybody to hate, because they did raise some taxes, they did restrain some mandatory spending, and they did impose some discipline on discretionary spending across the board. Yet, I think the consensus of economic opinion is that that they are at least an important ingredient in the discipline that was achieved and the period of surpluses that we enjoyed. Now, we're far from that now. We're far from that economically. We're far from it politically. We've had, from our Republican friends, $1.5 trillion in tax cuts, mainly benefiting the wealthiest people and groups in this society, totally unpaid for. Restraint, the only restraint that seems to be proposed these days is on domestic discretionary spending, leaving the rest of the budget aside. That strikes me as a lose-lose proposition. You're not really addressing the overall fiscal crisis with constraining only domestic discretionary spending, but at the same time, you're starving our country of needed investments. So all that by way of asking you, what should we be looking for in the way of a comprehensive approach to this? Is sometimes we call it a grand bargain. Is that still the best bet if our politics could ever come around to achieving that? Are there any different ingredients that would need to be achieved? So I'm interested in the impact of such comprehensive budget policies in the past and what the implications are for the dilemma that you very well outlined.
Well, I want to steer a little clear of recommending policy changes, so I'll try to talk generally about this. The debt problem now is really large. And under current laws we're going, it's going to be a bigger and bigger problem, so the longer we wait, the more draconian the measures would have to be to fix it. So one of the things that's an important thing is to think about something early. And second is the debt's at a high level, so you need something big to change. You talked about discretionary spending. One of the reasons that I often make the point about just the net interest cost of the current debt is on its way to exceed all of defense spending. And it's on its way after 30 years of maybe exceeding all of discretionary spending, just the interest cost. That's not fixing the problem, that's just holding it still. So the problem is getting much bigger than discretionary spending, for example. So if you have to think about things, you need to think big, and you think in terms of revenues, you need to think in terms of spending. One or the other or both things are perfectly fine. I think it's helpful. This is close. I don't want to make recommendations, but having some sort of plan, I think, would be a good signal.
Well, what quickly can you say about the history of this? Were those three agreements an important ingredient of the fiscal discipline achieved at the 90s?
Those things all contributed. I haven't done a detailed analysis of that. But I do want to point out that that was a different time than now. Right? There were a couple of things we had going for us that we don't have going for us now. One was that productivity surge, and the other was a more quickly growing labor force. Heading forward, unless we have an unexpected surge in productivity or I don't know what would happen on the labor force side, we have an aging workforce. Those things are going to be big drags going forward, and it's going to make it more difficult to deal with this than perhaps was the time in the late 1990s.
I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw, for 5 minutes.
Thank you for being here. I appreciate what the CBO does. You have the most difficult job imaginable, which is giving apolitical advice to Congress. I can't even imagine that. The reason we're here, I believe, is because we have a fundamental difference in question of why deficits exist, whether it's spending or too little taxes. But it's really a fundamental question of why government exists in the first place. If you believe government exists to sustain itself and fund pet projects for politicians, well, then it therefore makes sense to simply tax the people in order to fund that. If you believe that government exists to protect inalienable rights and freedoms, well, then we have a difference of opinion. And so the question then becomes, okay, and as my colleagues have pointed out, what has actually caused these deficits? So we're going to go through some numbers specifically on the tax cuts from last year. According to CBO's projections right now, the debt in 2029 is projected to be $33.7 trillion, correct?
That sounds right.
Correct. The tax cuts cost $1.5 trillion, and was that with or without dynamic scoring?
Well, it was $1.9 trillion with everything included with dynamic scoring.
Okay, so okay, well, let's just leave it at 1.5 then. That's the
Yeah, that just doesn't include the extra interest cost of the debt.
Okay. So 33.7 minus 1.5 is 32.2. So without the tax cuts, our debt in 10 years would still be 32 trillion. With the tax cuts, it would be 33 trillion. It's not a huge difference. The tax cuts also do what they were designed to do. They've increased job growth. They've increased wages. And it's also worth highlighting, and according to the graph you gave us, revenues continue to increase every year. What are they? Do you know off the top of your head what they're projected to increase just next year? This is government revenue.
Right. I don't off the top of my head, but.
Okay. It's over about $100 billion increase from the year before. Also worth noting, according to this graph you gave us, as a percentage of GDP, meaning relative to the size of the economy, revenues have basically stayed around the same. In fact, they've been on an upward trajectory, again, with the tax cuts. The government continues to make more money as a percentage of GDP. Is that correct?
That's right, although I will caution a little bit of that is the expiration of the reduction in individual income taxes. So
right.
If
If politicians decide to to increase people's taxes.
That's right.
Correct. So when my colleagues say that it is absolutely clear that tax cuts from last year are the only reason that we have these deficits, is that really true?
Deficits are much larger.
Okay, that's what I figured. So it brings us to our next issue then, which is mandatory spending. It's true that 70% of our spending in government is mandatory side, right?
Yes.
So, and it is also accurate that mandatory spending on health programs alone will double from 1.3 trillion in 2019 to 2.4 trillion in 2029?
Yes.
That's according to your estimates. So, well, in the little time we have, the CBO does analysis on certain policy considerations. You're not recommending policies, but you do analysis on certain policy recommendations. When it comes to mandatory spending programs like Medicare and Social Security, what are some of the top recommendations that you all analyze?
Well, I'll tell you, I'll point you to a report that we recently finished, Options to Reduce the Deficit. It's a rather big volume. It's about 120 different options that Congress could take, all of which would reduce the deficit on the spending side, revenue side. We give you an actual estimate so you get some idea of how much bang for the buck you'd get.
And my last question, how much would you have to raise taxes without changing spending? How much would you have to raise taxes in order to not even balance our budget, but get our deficits on par with our growth, meaning that debt to GDP ratio would actually stay the same?
I think if you raised everybody's taxes, all the tax rates by about 10 percentage points, 10%, that would generate enough revenue to reduce the deficit down to about 0.
10%.
That's not fixing the debt.
Okay. 10%, which would be a pretty enormous raise
It
for,
would, and it's
for,
only-
for quite a lot of people. And what is the best indicator of your wealth in a group of people? Would you say it's age? Would age be a good indicator of wealth if you had a random group of people?
Well, sure, age is definitely associated.
Then, my last closing comments, as I'm out of time, would be to say that what we're talking about when we're talking about expanding entitlement programs is taxing the poor to pay for the rich. That's what we're actually talking about, because you're taxing people in my generation to pay for people who have had their entire lives to save. And we have to question whether that's fair. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Chakowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, and Mr. Hall for being here. You know, one of the things that the shutdown, I think, illustrated, many people think about federal jobs as middle-class jobs. And what we actually saw was that these are workers who live paycheck to paycheck, and a couple of them gone means that they are in serious, sometimes crisis, going to food pantries. But it also reflects, I think, what the majority of workers face. We find out, there's been research that even a $500 accident or something happening, that most families can't afford that. One of the benefits that was promised in the tax cuts, or projected in the tax cuts, was that it would spur rapid wage growth for workers. But it actually appears that instead of delivering raises for workers, that corporations use their windfall to enrich their shareholders through stock buybacks. In fact, 2018 set a record, with companies spending more than $1 trillion on buybacks. And so my question to you is, how do these buybacks affect the economy? And do you see their effect in your most recent estimates of economic growth? And do those buybacks actually then interfere with wage growth?
Well, let me first say, we expected stock buybacks. It was part of our forecast. And what we've seen happen so far is not at all inconsistent with what we expected. So buybacks actually aren't bigger than we thought they would be.
No, I just want to say, I'm not surprised either.
Right.
That money
I'm
went to
just working,
buybacks.
I'm warming up here to get to your question.
Yeah, okay.
The wage impact of that is less clear to us. Whether the stock buybacks will impact wage growth or not. And we think the labor market's tightening up, and we think wages are starting to rise, and we think they will rise in the future. You know, it's hard to say what the effect of stock buybacks, if that's had, or that's going to have an effect on wage growth.
Did you expect any higher wage growth as a result of the tax cuts?
I think we did in the long run because the tax cuts lowered the cost of capital, lowered the cost of work. So we did expect more people to re-enter the labor market like has perhaps been happening. We expected a higher investment. So we thought that would raise wages some. We did forecast that, but we expect that over 10 years.
Another claim was that the Republican tax bill would increase investment, which in the case of an industry like pharma, like the pharmaceutical companies, could in theory lead to lower costs for consumers. And we would all agree that that would be a good thing, but last summer I wrote to the CEO of Eli Lilly, and actually of some other companies as well, asking him about the impact on consumers' out-of-pocket costs for different drugs. And their response left a lot to be desired. And Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit for the record my letter as well as the response from Eli Lilly.
Without objection.
So my question to you, Mr. Hall, is have you analyzed the impact of pharmaceutical companies' decision to invest in buybacks rather than lowering out-of-pocket costs for consumers on the trajectory of our out-of-pocket health care spending for middle-class Americans?
Well, we do keep track of pharmaceutical prices, and we do try to monitor them. We've done some looking at that. Relying on my memory now is not very good, but we can follow up and talk to you about what we see with the pharmaceutical prices and talk about what we think could be an impact going forward, if you like.
In general, did you see that we had any lowering of consumer prices as a result of the tax cuts that many big industries enjoyed with the tax cut?
I think that's something that right now would be impossible to tell in such a short time period, and it would require us to do a little more research than we've done.
I think I don't have time for a third question. Thank you, Mr. Hall.
The gentlelady's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Hearn. 5 minutes.
Director Hall, it's great to be here. It's great to be a freshman with all the challenges we have ahead of us here. As a small business owner for over 34 years in various industries, having the privilege of serving as a CFO for a large franchise group all over the country, I've seen the problems we have across the country and the various issues we have when intrusion into job creators and trying to put people to work. So I've been on the other side of these policies that I'm on a venture now to create or to unwind, if you will. You know, if I ran my businesses like we run the federal government, we'd be out of business a long time ago. And so I would have to assume that in that realm, it's not like a business, but it is about how we get after growing and stimulating our economy and controlling spending. It's math. You're a math guy. I happened many years ago to get an MBA from the University of Arkansas, so familiar with that area, familiar with the economics. There is no other solution. No matter how much we try to color it up, we have to get after both. Much has been made about the 1996 welfare to work. Not much has been made about that, but a lot's been talked about the results of that act that President Clinton signed when we had a Republican House and Republican Senate. And the results of that is that we encouraged people that were able-bodied to go back to work into a growing workforce, a job market, and we saw budget surpluses in 97, 8, 9, and 2000. We had a tech burst in 2000 that caused that to start unwinding a little bit because we were focused on one industry. We did have labor participation hit 67%, the highest in recorded history that we know of. Today, we are at 4% less than that, roughly, 63%. We're pretty much maxed out on who can go to work in this economy. We have an aging population. We have employment rates that are considered beyond full, that are, I question whether they are still looked at the same way as they were 50 years ago. The mandatory spending levels are growing at a rate that's unsustainable. The amount of money that we all appropriate and argue over and fuss over up here is diminishing quite rapidly as compared to the GDP, so that we're only after just a small portion of our budget that we're talking about. The rest of it's on autopilot. The fertility rates in this country to maintain a population that will keep this country as we know it today is woefully low. It's below the 2.1%. So with all that said, and the dire note that you made that the interest rate very quickly is going to, or the interest on our debt is going to surpass our ability to protect ourselves, or the money we spend to protect ourselves, I'm always looking at, this is what we know. And you have the ability to look at various things, because at the end of the day, it's just math and behavior. What are some of the ideas, and you alluded to it, the 120 different options we have to change some of our trajectory, but could, in my short period of time that's left here, could you share with us just a couple of things that are imminent, or does that get into the policy side?
Imminent as in which?
What we could change, as an example.
Right, sure.
What would be the impact? There's been much said about the $15 hour minimum wage.
Right.
What would that do to us both in the short term and long term? There's been much made about legal immigration. How much legal immigration do we need to get us back on, to make up for the 2.1 differential?
Well, with respect to the minimum wage, we'd have to see a proposal. We've certainly been thinking about that. We did an analysis in 2014 of a 10% minimum wage. We're thinking about the 15 that's been talked about, so I don't want to guess as to what the numbers are going to look like in something like that. And I'm sorry, the other thing was the...
Well, how much legal immigration do we need to add to replace our aging workforce so that we can sustain our mandatory spending levels?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that one. You know, generally if you increase immigration, first of all, the impact depends upon what kind of immigration you're talking about. It's not just any immigration that it's all the same. It differs a little bit. If you talk about it broadly, if you increase the labor force, you increase GDP because you have a bigger labor force. But it does matter what kind of immigration you have and that sort of thing. So it's hard for me to give you some idea of what would fix things.
But as it relates to immigration, it would be some combination of skill versus wages for those skills across the entire spectrum, correct?
Right, yeah, the research suggests that the higher skilled immigrants actually can raise productivity in an economy. The lower skilled, more basic ones probably don't as much, and they actually probably crowd out wage increases for the lower skilled folks who are here now.
And also would crowd out the ability for younger Americans to get that first-time job, to start learning the process of work.
Right, right. And that's actually one of the concerns if you look at labor force participation by age right now. Once you get the baby boomers, past the baby boomers, the rates are still pretty low, even today, lower than they were for the baby boomers.
Thank you. I could spend like 4 or 5 more days asking you questions, but thank you so much for your time, and thank you for the difficult job that you have.
Gentlemen, now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, congratulations, and thank you for the opportunity to serve on this committee. Dr. Hall, thank you for your testimony. I appreciated the materials that were sent over. Only had a brief chance to look at them since you released them yesterday, but I'm anxious to pour through them. But I had a couple of very basic questions. The first is, and I've asked a number of people this, and I have a hard time getting an answer. Maybe you could take a whack at it. What, in your opinion, should the optimal debt level be as a percentage of GDP?
Well, CBO has very intentionally avoided making recommendations like that. What's the optimal debt level? We wouldn't offer an opinion on that. We can give you some idea of where the debt level is, what some changes that, if you suggested some changes being made, we could tell you what it would likely be as a result. But I wouldn't want to tell you what I think the optimal is.
It is hard to figure out from a policy point of view where you want to be when the folks that you rely on have a difficult time coming to it. Obviously, you're concerned about the increasing debt as a percentage of GDP. But it's curious just because it's hard to guide your thinking when you don't know where the target is. But I may want to pursue that line of questioning with you further offline. I did want to, first of all, thanks for the report, which was very helpful. And as I poured through it in the last day and a half, much like I think my colleague, Mr. Hearn, expressed, I see this in part as something of a function of demographics, and I've been thinking about the U.S. population. So the percentage of people over the next 10, 20 years and beyond that are in the workforce as a percentage of all Americans versus the number of retirees is clearly changing, and that's driving a fair amount of this. Is that, am I reading that effectively the right way?
That's right, yes.
So, and also, Mr. Hearn mentioned fertility rates and the replacement of workers. So, as I think about this, if you have enough people in the workforce who are working as a percentage of the number of people retired, then essentially part of your problem goes away. Even the mandatory spending just becomes a fixed number. If you could maintain the percentages that had been enforced 30 years ago, you'd have a much different picture, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
That's what's driving a lot of this.
Yes.
Which does lead us to have the conversation about immigration, because it's clear that given the incumbent population, we don't have enough people, and the fertility rate is not enough, as I understand it from reading. So that does, in terms of the imperatives around debt and debt burden in the out years, immigration policy will play a very significant role in how we address debt. Is that correct? Would you?
Well, that's right. To the degree it affects the labor force, and labor force is an important sort of part of the recipe for growth and revenues and budget spending.
Good. So I do want to come back to you at some point about that. I'm also inclined to be concerned about the impact that climate change is having on debt loads. And one of the things that I thought about a couple of months ago when we were doing a orientation for freshman members and we were talking about debt, occurs to me that unanticipated international engagements, unanticipated natural disasters, which are certainly occurring at a higher rate with concerns by the scientific community and many of us about climate impacts, that those will have a much greater impact, and we're going to be in a much more precarious position related to how much we can address those through debt because of the situation we find ourselves in. And to me, those are two very, very grave dangers looking forward. Do you factor that in here?
Yeah, it is implicitly in there. That's right. And I can give an ad. We've done some work, for example, of we do have a nice piece on the impact of increased hurricane frequency because of climate change. It'll give you some idea of how much we think that'll impact the economy and the budget going forward.
Yeah. And the last point I just wanted to, I think I'm reading this right in terms of the charts. I looked at 1969 and 2029, and it's hard to tell exactly on the charts with these numbers, but it looks to me, though, outlays in 1969 were about 18.75% of GDP. In 2029, they're expected to be 23%, whereas revenue has actually dropped as a percent of GDP over that period of time. And even if you look at just today, those outlays have gone from 18.75 to about 20%. I'm looking at your line, whereas on the revenue side, 18.75 to about 17%. So I want to come back at some point to talk about the immigration policy and having more people in the workforce, and appreciate all your great work, sir.
Sure.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Burchett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's Burchett. Birch like the tree and et like I just ate lunch. But thank you so much. I appreciate that. And thank you, Ranking Member, for your indulgence. Yes, sir. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And as a freshman, I would like to say I still don't have a door on my bathroom, but I understand that Mr. Hall has little or nothing to do with that, so I will not bring that up during our conversation. Although my daughter did say I could put a curtain across there, and I told her, I said, baby, this isn't church camp. We got to have a little more prestige here in the United States Congress. But Dr. Hall, I want to thank you so much for indulging us with your questions. And I want to ask you a question about tariffs. It seems that the President mentioned tariffs, and you know, you hear the dark clouds are looming. But I remembered, I think it was either my first or second sophomore year in college, that in the 80s, that we were one of the only American motorcycle manufacturer was about to go out of business because the Japanese were in fact dumping motorcycles, and it was primarily the 1,000cc bikes and above onto the market for cheaper than they could actually produce them, and then they would drive everybody else out of business. Then they'd jack the prices up. And I've noticed that we are now exporting to China rice now. It seems that some of these
talks of tariffs have brought some of our sometimes friends and sometimes enemies to the table, and I wonder if you could comment on that and the effects that has on our economy.
Sure, sure. Let me say how tariffs are working into our forecast here. Right now, tariffs imposed are impacting about 11% of imports. We think that is reducing GDP by maybe 0.1% on average over the next 10 years. But it's generating about $34 billion in customs duties next year. So we've assumed that those stay in place forever, or they stay in place for the time period. We've not assumed the scheduled tariff increases, that those occur yet, because the President seems to have a lot of discretion on that, so we're going to wait to see if actually that effect gets done. The effect of just tariffs themselves are kind of like any other tax. It's a tax on imports. It's a tax paid by domestic importers. And then the burden, the price can be borne by foreign producers, U.S. businesses, U.S. consumers, that sort of thing. And then you have the retaliations probably affecting exports. So those are all sort of the direct effects. It's not the strategic aspects of the tariffs, which I think is a bit of what you're talking about. But we have talked about that, and like I say, the effects are the kinds of effects are well known. The actual numbers are a little bit hard to come by, because it's hard to know how much will be passed forward and not passed
Sort
forward.
of an after effect. I mean, you see it after it's already done, and then you come back and tell us, and then.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
All right. Another question I had is, at least in Tennessee, the tax cuts are working and revenue's growing. If you want a job, you can find a job in Tennessee. And it seems obvious that the increased mandatory spending is the problem. In fact, our ranking member speaks very eloquently on this. I'm not quite at that level. But in your opinion, what is the source of that problem?
The mandatory spending is I think is relatively clear. We have an aging population, and there's no way around that. That's driving a lot of it, including the health care costs. And even the aging population aside, we have rising health care costs that rise faster than GDP. They have for a long time. We think they're going to continue to rise faster. There's those two things that are really driving this big increase in the deficit and spending going forward.
All right. See, I have one more question, if that'd be all right. Mandatory spending programs, seems like they're approaching some unsustainable levels. And could you share your thoughts on being a little more fiscally responsible with those programs? I realize you have to be careful about opinions. I understand that.
Yeah, sorry if it sounds this way, but read our book, our options to reduce the deficit. We really do have a number of options there.
It's just like in college where I have to buy the professor's book that actually is teaching the class.
That's right. And we're happy to follow up and talk about any of those things and how to scale them, that sort of thing.
I will warn you about that. My buddy Shady Ward found a bunch of those at the used bookstore, and then he went and bought them and sold them back to the University of Tennessee at the full cost. So just remember that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Lee, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this hearing. Thank you, Ranking Member Womack, and good to be back on the committee. Thank you, Director Hall, for being here. Let me ask a couple of questions, and following up really from Mr. Hearn's line of questioning from a different perspective. First of all, we know that Americans not only need jobs, but they need to be paid a living wage to lift themselves and their families out of poverty. Unfortunately, wages have remained very stagnant, with the federal minimum wage still at $7.25 an hour. Yet the cost of living has increased on average, I think it's by about 12%. Now, at the same time, the value of the minimum wage has fallen by 20%, and there's not a single county in the country where a minimum wage matches the local cost of living. And so let me ask you, in terms of just economic impacts, what would raising the federal minimum wage to a living wage so people can take care of their families, what type of impact would that have on economic growth and the budget outlook? Secondly, let me just ask you, I want to ask my questions in one block. In terms of just strong wage gains, I don't see any predicament or prediction, excuse me, for unemployment in communities of color, which at least, and I just have to say, in the African American community is still double that of white unemployment. It's 6.6% in the black community. In my home state, the unemployment rate among African Americans is at 10.7%. So how do you address this disparity in unemployment rates, which are very large in the African American community, as well as the impact of a living wage on economic growth and the outlook for our budget?
Sure. I need to be a little careful talking about minimum wage because, you know, we would need to see exactly what the minimum wage was if there was a proposal and work through the impacts. On the most basic level, right, raising the minimum wage raises the cost of hiring somebody. So one of the really key things is, does that discourage employment or not, right? So a relatively modest increase in minimum wage will have a less likelihood of that. If a very large one could have a labor market impact like that. But if it does not discourage employment, then of course wages go up and you have
so we don't know historically if it has or has not encouraged or discouraged employment.
Well, I think we did a report on raising the minimum wage 10% in 2014, and we did talk about the effect, especially in low-skilled workers, as having an effect on lowering employment in some places. A lot of that depends upon local cost of living, local wages, that sort of thing. So the result is almost mixed by part of the country because, you know, if local wages are already pretty close to minimum wage, then that's much less of an impact, both good and bad. If it's well off that, then the impact really depends a lot on the labor market. We really do look carefully at the literature and see what sort of reaction in the past has happened. For example, if we were to look at minimum wages now, we'd look at the recent experience at the state level, sort of see how those impacted employment and et cetera. But the concern on it would be the low-skilled end of things, because those would be the people who would be most likely to be adversely affected, but also they're the ones you're looking to help at the same time. I'm trying to give you a bit of a wishy-washy answer on purpose.
Yeah, I understand that, but also I do understand that the 12% cost of living increase, you look at that as compared to the federal minimum wage. We've got to figure out how to address that because people shouldn't have to live at $7.25 per hour with a 12% cost of living increase throughout the country.
Yeah, and with the differential unemployment rates, that's a tough one. It's been around for a long time. One of the things that really has always jumped out at me is when we go into recession, the people who are most hurt are people who already have high unemployment rates. So you actually see for example, the African American unemployment rate really increasing during recessions, more so than for other groups.
But Director Hall, I want to know, though, how you see this gap being closed because, again, 6.67% unemployment rate in the African American community. In my state, 10.7% in the Golden State of California. That's unacceptable. And so we've got to come up with a specific strategy as it relates to communities of color, the African American and Latino communities, in terms of how to begin to close that gap.
I will beg off because we don't make policy recommendations.
I understand that, but you can tell us what some of the economic assumptions are and how we could begin to look at policy recommendations.
We're happy to talk about what we think would be the effect of particular policy proposals. That's sort of what we do.
But you couldn't tell us what policy proposals would make sense or not.
No, I would beg off from doing that.
Yeah, okay.
I'm happy to follow up and talk about some of the proposals if you like.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Absolutely. Gentlelady's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Musser.
Maybe I'm not the only one making a rookie mistake, all right? My
first hearing with the Budget Committee. I'm very happy to be here. I hope our work on this committee results in a more balanced, effective budget for the people and the taxpayers that are counting on us to bring accountability and return on investment of their money. Dr. Hall, you've undoubtedly heard the saying, we don't have a revenue problem, we have a spending problem. I served as Secretary of Department of Revenue in Pennsylvania, and I always felt that this statement bared a lot of truth. And I also know that job creation and wage increases was the best revenue generator. Currently, our national unemployment rate is 3.9%. 2 years ago, it was 4.7%. This is an increase of 4.8 million jobs across the country. Can you provide an estimate of the revenue increase of a 0.8% decrease in the unemployment rate?
We'd have to think about that. We could probably work through something with that.
Okay. And on wages as well. Do you have an estimate of what the wages increase were over the last 2 years or just over the last year?
Well, wages have been surprisingly, unexplainably flat. And they are starting to rise now. The labor market is genuinely getting tight. And we do forecast that wage growth is actually going to continue and strengthen going forward. We don't have sort of a budgetary impact of that sort.
That's what I expect as well. And was it in the neighborhood of about 4% over the last 6 to 8 months or 2 or 3 quarters?
I'd have to check. That number's not.
And I'd also be curious as to what your revenue numbers show for new revenue coming from wages, if that was something that we could get.
Yeah, we can follow up and probably give you a feel for that.
Great. I mean, that certainly provides some guidance as to what needs to be focused on in order to best raise revenues, of course. The GDP has improved over the last 2 years. 2017, we were at 2.3%. 2018, we were at 3.1, 3.2. What is projected for 2019 GDP?
We have it slowing a bit to 2.3%.
Okay. So what would you estimate, and it may be in your summary here, the level of revenue increase for a 1% increase in GDP?
1%. We'd have to look that up.
Okay.
We have some those interactions we've got. You can vary productivity, and that's pretty close to varying GDP, and that gives you some idea of the budgetary impact of that.
All right. Well, it's fair to say we have a strong economy, we're growing jobs, and we are increasing revenue. What was the percentage of revenue increase over the past 2 years or even just the past year? In 2018 or 2017?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm sorry.
All right. What I have, what is projected for 2019 is 5.6%. That's very high. When I was revenue secretary, a 4-year period, we grew revenues by about 10.5%. In the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, that's 2.5, 2.6% a year. So we're projected to grow revenues next year by $186 billion or 5.6%. That's strong. Would you agree?
Yes. Is that from our numbers?
It is.
Oh, okay, then.
Okay.
I'll stand by
And
this.
now the percentage of spending increases over the past 2 years was my next question, but we'll forego that. And we do have a projected revenue in 2019 of 7.4% or $304 billion. That's extraordinarily high. 7.4% increase in spending. In fact, I was surprised to see that. The most that we ever had when I served as revenue secretary for the 6th largest state and the 19th largest economy in the world was about 4%, which frankly was about a 1.5 points too high, since we had to have a balanced budget. So I would just add, based on these numbers, and if you go back 5 years, where our spending levels were in 2013. In 2013, our spending levels were equivalent to where they were in 2018. So I look at that, and not to mention the fact that prior to 2013, we had 4 years of the largest, unprecedented level of spending, as you're well aware, $5.4 trillion over a 4-year period. And yet, even with that prior, the 2013 levels of spending are equivalent now to where our revenue levels were. And it's data like this that tells me that we always want to try to increase revenues. We want the strongest economy and the most competitive tax rates that has the largest
max-min possible, but we really have continue to have a huge spending problem. So clearly, these numbers show that, and what we are hearing today, I'm looking at things like this, with enormous levels of spending, with no chance that a higher rate of taxes, unless it was near 100%, would cure. Would you agree that we largely have one side of the ledger is more of a problem than the other, meaning spending?
I would try to avoid, in a sense, taking sides. Obviously, one needs either less spending or more revenue or both to fix this problem.
I think the gentleman's time has expired. And now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hall, appreciate your presence. And I remember in the opening comments, we were challenged to state what our plan was. And I can tell you that our plan is to resort to PAYGO, where you don't have $1.5 trillion in unpaid for tax cuts. In fact, if you go back, as Mr. Connor was asking, to 2000, when we had a significant surplus. I remember 2001, after President Clinton left office, Chairman Greenspan was peppered with questions at a hearing as what would happen when there's no government debt, because we were projected at that time to pay off the entire debt held by the public by 2008, and by 2013 return all the money to the trust funds. But we had massive tax cuts, fought 2 wars without paying for it, passed a prescriptive drug benefit without paying for it, violating the PAYGO principle, and all of a sudden we're back heavily in the ditch. If we had paid for everything we have done since 2000 and hadn't cut taxes without paying for them, we'd be in a lot better shape than we are now. One question I had, have you been following the multi-pension employer crisis?
Yes, we do have some work on that. Yeah.
We have noticed that if these pension funds, well, there's an old saying, if you don't change directions, you're going to end up where you're headed. We're headed to many of these funds going bankrupt, taking down people's pensions and taking down a lot of businesses. Have you calculated what impact that would have on the federal budget in terms of increased food stamps, Medicaid, lower taxes?
I'm not sure. We have a report on it. I'd have to take a look at that. We can get you that report. I'm not sure if that would be in there or not. I think we do talk about some proposals to help fix the problem, at least.
The proposals to fix the problem, best we can determine, are actually cheaper than letting the problem occur. So that doing nothing is about the stupidest thing that we can do, because the effect on the budget will be profound. And there are a lot of suggested proposals that are cheaper than to the hit on the federal budget, ignoring all of the pain and suffering. Can you tell me a little bit about what the effect immigration has on Social Security? Immigration policy?
Sure. We would have to, changes in policy, we would have to know what the change is and do an evaluation of that sort of thing. Immigration, I think right now we've settled into something like a little under 1 million legal immigrants a year coming in. That contributes to the labor force growth. I don't know that we've done anything in particular about what if that immigration didn't happen.
If you have people coming in working, they'd be contributing to Social Security.
Right.
And that would actually help the Social Security crisis. Is that right?
Yeah, I think we've done some work of that. I'm not remembering exactly what we found. If I could follow up with you, I could give you some idea of what we found with the effects of that on.
You indicated that the tax cut was helping to pay for itself. I understand that the later years in this decade, the tax cut actually is a drain on revenues. Is that right?
Well, our analysis is that the tax bill does leave GDP over 10 years at a higher level on average. It's about 7/10 higher, the level on average through the decade. So there is that going forward. I'm not sure about the pay for aspect at the end. I'd have to
I thought in your testimony you said it actually had a drag on the economy in the last few years.
Well, no, the lower taxes on investment in particular probably is helping economic growth in the near term. I think perhaps the part that I referred to was the end of the stimulus from the tax bill going away. It's going to leave us with slower growth in the next couple of years. So that's the drag, I think.
Right, slower growth because of the tax cut.
Right, the stimulus effects will wear off. Right.
And there'll be slower growth because of the tax cut.
Right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time's expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding the hearing. You have always been one of my top 2 choices to chair this committee, and I'm glad to see you in that chair today. Mr. Hall, you were talking about inexplicably flat wage growth. I'm not an economist. I'm a lawyer. Help me to understand what we call wage growth. I think about when we went into the Great Recession, and folks who would have been working in a top financial institution in my community were now working the customer service desk at Macy's. They were making the top wage there at the Macy's customer service desk, but they were making substantially less than they were making in the financial services industry. Does that count as a wage drop? Is that reflected in wage growth statistics when you move from one job type to another?
It does. It depends a little bit on which measure you're talking about. Something simple like just wages, it doesn't capture that very well. One of the things that we look at is something called the Employment Cost Index, which sort of holds the composition of the labor force constant and look at how wages drop. So different wage measures tell you different things. Some of them include full compensation, some don't include all the compensation. So there are a lot of measures, and they sort of can tell you sometimes a little bit different pictures of things.
Because when we look at the who's quitting their job index, more Americans leaving the job they had to pursue new opportunities, it just stands to reason to me that if more Americans are taking advantage of a superior opportunity, more Americans are acting in their own economic self-interest, we should see a positive bump in those remuneration measurements somewhere. But we're not, as you pointed out, in wage growth. Help me to understand why.
Sure. Well, we're not really sure because we didn't expect this, and I think the profession didn't expect wages to take quite so long to get going, but they are starting to get going now. We have seen some growth. The ECI in particular, I mentioned, was one that we look at, and we think that it's going to continue going forward because the labor market's still pretty tight. We still think the unemployment rate, even though it's very low, we still think it can go down from here. So we do think it's going to increase going forward.
Thinking about Mr. Scott's question about long-term economic growth, as long as I've been on this committee, as long as you've been in your position, you've come and made that same testimony. There are things we can do early that will benefit us early, but they'll cost us later, or there are things we can do that will cost us early that will benefit us later. We're always in that trade-off. I look at the long-term growth numbers, your projections this year from the 2017 projections 2 years ago. And we're about 1/10 of a percentage point off in long-term growth from your projections 2 years ago in the out years. But we're $1 trillion higher in GDP 10 years out from there. We've had growth in these near-term years 50% higher than what you would have anticipated 2 years ago. What's the long-term measure that we look at to say, yes, there is a trade-off between what we do early and what we do late, but it's worth it? What do the economists look at to say it's worth it?
Well, one of the ways to think about it is we have really kind of 2 distinct models that we use to forecast growth. One is a demand-side model. It sort of looks in detail about where we are now and where we're going. That has all the detail about consumer behavior and investment and that sort of thing. But we also have a second model, which is a long-term model, which is a supply-side model. And it generates something we call potential GDP, potential growth, which is that supply side. And that's the one that tells you where we're going, we think, in the long run. So we then focus on things like labor force growth and productivity and capital investment and that sort of thing. And those are the things that are going to be the big determinants of long-run growth and long-run prosperity.
And you
is that
use the
supply
term
side.
long run to describe what time window?
Yeah, and by long run, I kind of mean once the economy reaches its potential. You know, by potential I mean the supply side constraint on where we can go. We only have so many workers. We only have so much capital. That's sort of what I mean by the long run, when that constraint becomes binding.
So as I look at the projections you've made this year versus those you made prior to the tax cuts, I see a larger GDP than you had expected in the 10-year window,
Right.
Suggesting cumulative growth greater than you had expected in the 10-year window. I recognize the concerns that folks have about we're trading away prosperity tomorrow for prosperity today, but it seems like we have increased prosperity relative to your expectations just 2 years ago over the entire 10-year window.
Well, when we looked at the effect of the tax cut, we expected the tax cut raised GDP last year by about 0.3 of a percentage point. So it did have an impact on growth there. We think the impact continues going forward, so that on average over 10 years, we think the GDP level will be 0.7 of a percentage point higher. So we do think we have a bigger economy this next 10 years because of the tax cut.
Okay, gentleman's time has expired. Sure. I now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Boyle.
Thank you, and congratulations, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, first and foremost, for the work that the CBO does at this, especially at this point in the history of this institution, the history of our country, to have public servants who are attempting to call the balls and strikes is an incredibly important public service. So I want to say thank you to you and everyone who works at CBO. With respect to the deficits, it appears that the latest projection is that the deficit will reach just under $1 trillion in this fiscal year, and then exceed $1 trillion for a number of years to come. The deficit has spiked dramatically this past year, specifically because of the GOP tax cut that wasn't paid for. Can you cite for me, and I should add, we're approximately 9 years into this economic expansion. Can you cite for me any other time in American history during an economic expansion where you have seen such a dramatic increase in the deficit?
No, not really. And in fact, the visual summary that I handed out, if you sort of look at that visual summary, you sort of get to see deficits historically. And one of the interesting things to me is if you look at this and look at, 1980 was a recession. We saw the deficit spike. 1990, they spiked. 2001, they spiked. 2008, they spiked. And now, they're not spiking, but they're at a really high level for such a low unemployment rate and for such strong growth. And that's different.
Yeah, and given the previous examples you cited, and you can go back even before 1980 and show the same thing, typically budgets, deficits dramatically increase when there's a recession.
Yes.
So when inevitably this economic expansion ends and there is another recession, what would you expect to happen to this already large budget deficit?
We think the deficit would likely increase. Now, we do, in the long run, when we do forecast, we do have a little bit lower growth in there because we think, okay, there might be a recession in there. And so growth, on average, is lower than we would forecast without a recession. So there's a recession sort of in there over 10 years, but it's not actually visible. But you're absolutely right. If we did hit a recession, we would expect the deficits to spike more than where they are now, which is already a high level.
Yeah. Let me just shift quickly to the longest government shutdown in American history. I was struck by the fact that the equity markets reacted almost not at all to this and to the effect on first quarter growth, presumably under the belief that anything we lost in the first quarter will then just be added back on in the second quarter. It's hard for me to understand how that squares with so many contractors who now will permanently lose the pay that they lost over the last month. Can you help me try to understand that? And do you agree with what seems to be the perception out there that this government shutdown, as awful as it was, somehow we would make back up the revenue and growth that was lost?
Well, first of all, when we did our estimate, we do think that federal spending, that federal agencies will spend their appropriation. So their spending stopped, but they will continue and they'll spend all the money. And we think that people who were not paid for a while, they'll get back to maybe to normal patterns. Part of what's not captured by that is the distributional effects, right? So we're looking at the effect over in the context of the entire economy, which is really huge. But if you look at the impact on just federal workers, it's much higher. If you look at the impact on private contractors, it's higher. And some of that effect's going to be permanent for those contractors. Even if the federal government goes ahead and spends the money, they aren't necessarily going to spend it the same way that they did before. So there's that distributional effect. And we also don't see it entirely recovering. We think that on the whole, we'll see some recovery over the next 3 quarters, but we'll still be, GDP output will still be short about $3 billion. You won't make up for that government output.
So just to underscore that point, we won't be, as you put it, entirely whole, and that's $3 billion that we lost because of this government shutdown.
That's our estimate, yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Hall, great to have you today. In 2016, I believe the yearly GDP was 1.5%. In 2017, it was 2.3%. And it's estimated 2018 is going to be 3.3%. So true, definitely, why would you say that it's went from 1.5 in 2016, 2.3 in 2017, and now 3.3 in 2018?
Well, part of it is the continued recovery from the Great Recession. The recovery was really quite slow. But we do think a lot of it was the stimulus from the Tax Act. We do think that that's had an impact, and there's been a bit of stimulus out there.
So what happened in 2003? I mean 2017, because the Tax Act was passed in December of 2017.
Right. We just sort of had a strengthening economy. It's quite possible.
Could it have been President Trump's regulatory relief?
That may have had an impact. It may have been. I do think there were probably some signs that people anticipated a tax act coming up, and that
or optimism by consumers.
That's quite possible. Yes.
Because of President Trump's policies.
Well, I would say anticipation of a tax act.
Of his policies, because he pushed tax reform, right?
Right.
Okay. I also we've heard some discussion in here earlier that said that tax revenues are up for last year. Is that correct?
I believe that's true, yes.
So after passage of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, what did we lose in revenue? Because the prior discussion from the gentleman from Pennsylvania said we have the highest deficit now because of the tax cut. So how much did we lose last year because of the tax cuts?
I'd have to look that up.
I think that's a pretty important issue. You made that, you didn't counter that statement.
Right.
So I would like that number of how much revenue we lost.
Okay. I can give you some idea. Just we'll follow up. But if you look at the second graph on the visual summary, you'll see that the revenues as a share of GDP sort of fell below 50-year averages. That's in part because of the Tax Act.
What your report did say, and correct me if I'm wrong, that because of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, we added 900,000 new jobs. Is that correct?
That's right, over a 10-year period.
Over a 10-year period?
That's right.
And also your report says that wages raised by $1.2 trillion over 10 years?
I don't know that number in my head, but if it's our estimate.
Those were the numbers that you gave us in spring of last year, and they also are in this report.
Well, we still stand by those numbers. We're still
So that's
happy with that
good,
estimate.
because
Yeah.
that's a highlight, and I think that we need to talk about wages increasing instead of your statement just earlier saying that they've been flat. Also, in your report in spring, and you just highlighted again, you said that the Tax Cut and Jobs Act will create 1.7 trillion in GDP. Is that correct?
What's that,
Over 10 years.
over 10 years? I'm not sure of that raw number. I've got the 0.7% higher on average over 10 years. That may work out to be that number.
Yeah, 7/10 over 10 years. Those were the numbers you gave us on the Ways and Means Committee, so I just wanted to highlight it. It shows the successes of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, of how it is growing the economy and how we're affected. I clearly believe that your report highlights that the policies that was pushed by President Trump and the Republican House and Senate for tax cuts clearly has showed a growth in the economy. And also, you made a statement earlier that you said that the economy would slow down at the expiration of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, correct?
Well, the individual income tax rates, if they go back up.
When they expire in a couple years.
Yes.
So you're basically testifying that by increasing taxes will slow the economy, correct?
That's right.
No further questions.
The gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm looking forward to serving with you and the other members of the committee. Dr. Hall, I'd like to ask you to expand on your office's report on the economic effects of the recent partial government shutdown. I'd specifically like to focus on the economic impact of missed pay by federal workers. There are 3,520 federal employees in Nevada who were furloughed or forced to work without pay during the 35-day government shutdown. That's 35 days of money that they could not buy groceries, repair their cars, pay for child care, or other contributions to Nevada's economy. In total, Nevada has 19,117 federal employees, and those are employees who are impacted by President Trump's recent executive order, which will prohibit them from receiving their scheduled pay increases this year.
Well, let me give you just a little context. There were 12 department and agencies affected by the partial shutdown, which is not trivial. It impacted about 800,000 people, which is about 40% of the federal workforce. And you're right, the lack of pay was something to the tune of $9 billion that those workers didn't get for that time period. And we think the effects, of course, are really strong on those workers. It's also, there's an indirect effect of their spending patterns change for a while. So you have impact on the rest of the economy as well.
So in addition to the impact from the shutdown, will the CBO release any kind of estimate on the public and private sector revenue loss as a result of the freeze in pay for these workers, both in Nevada and across the country?
Yeah, we haven't looked at the freeze and pay part, and I don't know that we have any plans to look at that.
Can I ask why not, since that's such a big part of the economic stimulus, both in the public and private sector?
Sure. It's not something we would normally, in a sense, we'll take it on board when we look at our forecast, budget forecast going forward. You know, we'll update this in the spring, so we'll take that into account. It's a little different for us to actually get down and do sort of a real detail analysis on the impact of just that, but that is something that we'll take on board and look at when we look at federal spending and then the economic growth aspect.
I think it's incredibly important. As you note, $9 billion of lost economic activity just in 35 days from people being furloughed. Right. The impact of people not receiving, you know, a pay increase of 2.9% in their pay is quite a significant loss, both in the public and the private sector. And that's loss, again, an ability for people to meet their individual needs, family needs, community needs, and I think that for whatever reason, there has not been enough discussion about the fact that Congress appropriated those funds for that pay increase, and the president unilaterally froze those pay increases. So I would like to request your office to provide that information once it's available.
Okay, yeah, we'll circle around and talk about it if you like.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. It's now my honor to yield for the first time to the ranking member, Mr. Womack, for 10 minutes.
Thank you very much to the chair, and thank you, Director Hall, for your continued work at CBO. And I think we've had a pretty good discussion today on your economic outlook, and there have been a lot of, I think, really substantive questions raised here. I'll try to amplify on some of those. It is obvious to my friends on the other side have targeted the corporate tax rate. They believe cutting the corporate tax rate down to 21% was ill-advised, and I think the plan right now is to move it to 28%. Can you give me a quick assessment as to what CBO thinks would happen in the event that the corporate rate went from 21 to 28%?
Sure. I suppose without doing the estimate, I suppose we would see sort of the inverse of what we saw from having it lowered to begin with. It would likely have an impact on investment, and lower levels of investment mean lower capital stock. So we might take a hit on GDP, might take a hit actually in wage growth a little bit from having that increase.
Without a model in front of you, what kind of a hit on GDP?
It's hard. It's hard to know. I don't want to sort of guess on that. We'd have to do some thinking on it. You know, I don't know that we separated out the effect of lowering the corporate tax rate to begin with. Really separated that out really carefully. I have to take a look and see what we've done.
Well, I know the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act has been assailed by my friends on the other side quite frequently. Economic growth of 3.1% in 2018, best since 2005. Unemployment projected to be 3.5% in 19, the lowest since the 1960s. I think it would be a stretch to say that the effects of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act did not have an impact on those two statistics. Would that be correct?
Well, that's right, and I think that was actually in our original forecast. I really do think we suggested that GDP was going to be at 0.3 higher in 2018. So some of that's we think from the Tax Act, and the same with the wage growth.
So assuming that's correct, that the growth rate and the unemployment rate coming down have been impacted by the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, then is it fair to say that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, from that standpoint, growth in the economy, lower unemployment, is in fact working?
Well, I think, let me put it this way, I don't want to sort of take sides, but I think it's...
I'm not asking you to take sides. I'm just simply asking the CBO director to opine whether the effects, based on your modeling, whether the effects of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, we can set aside the argument of does it pay for itself. I mean, that's an entirely different subject, because you have to look at tax rates instead of in a vacuum as a total package. I mean, we've got deregulation that's happening. That's having an impact on the confidence of the job creator out here. That's just one example of many. We've got portfolios that are going up on the stock exchange, where a whole lot of people have their 401ks, et cetera, invested, and so that's a consideration. We have some companies that are investing in health care now for their employees as a result of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that had not been previously provided. So using the metrics CBO has given us, growth in the economy, low unemployment, again, I ask, is it fair to say that from those standpoints, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is working?
I think we stand by our estimate, and I think our estimate's consistent with that there would be stimulus effect, there would be higher growth, there would be an increase in labor force participation from the Tax Act, and so far after a year, I think our estimate's looking pretty good.
So then would the inverse be true, that if you raise the corporate rate from 21 to 28%, and allow the individual rates to expire in whatever that 8th year is from the inception of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, that it would have an impact?
I think it would have an impact, and some of that would be on investment in capital stock and growth.
I want to pivot now to mandatory spending. We've talked a lot about it. it is one of my chief concerns. Because as you have already said today in your testimony and has been covered in your economic outlook, as a percentage of GDP, mandatory spending in your 10-year window, in your analysis, goes higher, and discretionary spending as a percentage of GDP goes lower. In your opinion as a director, is there a better argument or a better example of what on the spending side, we can set revenues aside, but on the spending side, is there a better example to illustrate the point that this country has a spending problem and it's not discretionary, it's mandatory?
Well, I won't offer an opinion on what the biggest problem is, but it is certainly true. I think discretionary spending right now is at a low level historically. You know, the lowest level I think ever historically is about 6% of GDP. We're at 6.3%, and we're heading for only 5%. So discretionary spending is heading towards its lowest level ever. Mandatory spending is growing, and it's growing towards its highest level. I don't think we're going to hit it in 10 years, but we're going to get pretty close. We're talking about having it get up to about 15% of GDP. So that is making a big contribution to the deficit.
In my opening, I asked my friends on the other side, what is your plan? Based on the notion that deficits and debt just continue to be piled onto future generations, and that given what I just said about the percentage of GDP tied up in mandatory versus the declining side on the discretionary, I'm not real confident that there is a plan out there, except maybe to try to tax our way out of it. By itself, are taxes going to solve the problem?
Taxes or spending or both. Obviously,
No, wait a minute, Director Hall. The question is, can we reasonably, you're an economist, can we reasonably tax our way out of this problem?
Well, the problem is what's reasonable. We can give you some idea of the effect of raising taxes, how much revenue that would generate. You know, in our options, we have the effect of raising, this is something that's worth looking at a little bit, of raising all tax rates 1%, and give you some idea. So if you put in maybe a 10% raise in all tax rates, you get something where the deficit starts to close. It gets pretty much to being closed. I'm not sure that solves the problem, because closing the deficit problem means, okay, now you've got the holdover debt problem to solve. So the tax change would have to be pretty large to overall fix the problem by itself.
We've been beat up on our side of the aisle because in our budget resolution last year, we did some reconciliation numbers, and we had some proposals that we were ready to present to deal with mandatory spending, particularly on the Medicare side, which is growing, as you've already said, faster, the healthcare costs growing faster than the growth of the economy, and that program is exceedingly expensive. If we don't do anything, if we just let things go as they are present, status quo, what happens to Part A?
It becomes a bigger and bigger part of our budget.
Is there an insolvency date?
Certainly the trust fund dates, we estimate those. I don't happen to have that in front of me, but it would come up.
2026?
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah. What about Social Security?
Same deal.
2033 maybe, 2032, 33, 34. DI, faster than that, but at the end of the day, the point I'm trying to make is that if we do nothing, if we just allow status quo, that these programs become insolvent on their own. So I think it begs that we do something, and that's where I think we're getting not necessarily crickets, but we just don't have a plan from the other side that is purposed in addressing the true drivers of the deficit and the debt. And it's not that we tax too little. It's that we have promised way too much, and these programs are running out of control and becoming so expensive that they're unsustainable in the long term. And I know my time is out. I'm not going to take any more time than my 10 minutes, and I yield back to the distinguished chairman.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Jayapal.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Feels good to say that. Welcome back, Mr. Hall. We appreciate your being here. If we are concerned about deficits, then let me just remind my colleagues that the Republican majority passed a $1.9 trillion tax giveaway to giant corporations and the wealthiest Americans. It included provisions that slashed the corporate rate, so the largest companies got giant windfalls, cut the top marginal tax rate for the richest Americans so that 83% of the benefits of the cuts went to the top 1% of taxpayers, and there were additional handouts for the wealthiest Americans, like the $40 billion that were showered on the owners of so-called pass-through businesses. Let's start with Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin's promises, because there were a lot of promises made about how the tax plan was going to benefit workers. And so, Mr. Hall, as the director of the CBO, you studied the tax plan and the budgetary effects of the legislation. Steve Mnuchin said that, quote, not only will this tax plan pay for itself, it will also pay down debt. So let me just ask you if the tax bill lived up to Steve Mnuchin's promise. Did the tax bill pay for itself? Just a yes or no is perfectly fine.
No.
It did not pay for itself. Now, let's look at whether the tax plan delivered for workers. Shortly after he signed the bill, President Trump said that corporations were, quote, already giving billions and billions of dollars away to their workers. He was referring to the bonus pay that some companies announced shortly after the bill became law. Mr. Hall, based on your understanding of how bonus compensation has changed since the bill passed, how much did the average American make in bonus pay as a result of the tax bill?
I don't know.
Well, I happened to do a little research into this topic for this hearing, and according to a recent study from the Economic Policy Institute based on 2018 data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, after adjusting for inflation, the average worker got an increase of only 2 cents per hour. Workers literally got pennies. So Republicans passed a $1.9 trillion tax plan. The money didn't go to workers, and it didn't go to paying down the debt. So where did it go? For one, companies spent $1 trillion on corporate stock buybacks last year alone. That is companies using their profits to buy back their own stock rather than paying their workers, investing in research and development, or making capital investments. And I think that's just a very important backdrop to have as we look at the economy and the effects of the Republicans' deficit spending that simply benefited the wealthiest individuals. You spent some time in your summary talking about immigration, and I believe that you looked at current immigration policy and you calculated that net immigration flows would grow by an average of 2% per year. Is that correct?
Yes.
And so when you look at current immigration policy, did you not factor in the president's proposal and Republicans' proposal last year that would dramatically restrict legal immigration to this country?
We did a current law estimate. So when we talk about it, we talk about it in terms of current law.
Right. So if the president's proposal were to go through, or Republicans' proposal restricting legal immigration, it would have dramatic effects on our economy and on our ability to continue to grow and our labor flows being supported.
We'd have to look at that specific proposal and do an analysis of it. I wouldn't want to offer an opinion now.
And Mr. Hall, do you know that that we have a near stagnant native-born population if you look at our economy?
I haven't looked at that, but I'm not surprised.
You trust me. Thank you. I appreciate that very much. Let me ask you about one of my favorite topics, which is the Social Security contributions of undocumented immigrants. Do you know if all undocumented immigrants were deported today, how much next year's Social Security trust funds would be reduced for benefit payments?
Yeah, I don't offhand.
Let me tell you how much that is. According to a marketplace report that just came out, approximately $13 billion less for benefit payments for existing Social Security recipients. And in 2016 alone, there were $13 billion paid into the Retirement Trust Fund and $3 billion to Medicare. And so I just would like the American people to understand the tremendous contributions that immigrants, both documented and undocumented, make to our economy. Mr. Hall, thank you so much for your presence, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady's time has expired, and now I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Thank you for being here and testifying with us here today. I've just got one quick question. As a Texan, as a former First Assistant Attorney General in Texas, you're aware that there's a large case pending, Texas versus the United States, involving Obamacare, regarding the constitutionality of that act. Which would have huge implications for Medicaid, for future mandatory spending. Did this case affect the development of the baseline or any projections with regard to the economy and future mandatory spending in your all's calculations?
It did not. Our practice is on something like this, is we wait till the appeals court deals with it before we think about taking it on board.
Okay, thank you. No further questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Now you myself 10 minutes. Director Hall, thanks once again for taking all of our questions and your statement and your work. I want to return to the issue of tax cuts for a second. Your report says, and your testimony said, that you estimate that about 30% of the tax cuts in the 2017 Act were paid for. They paid for 30%. They paid for 30% of it paid for itself, but left 70%. Would you actually define what that means? If only 30% of the tax cuts were paid for?
Right.
Yeah, explain what that means.
Sure. I'm not doing anything really sophisticated. We made an estimate of the tax cuts without taking the economic growth aspects into account, and we found that the tax bill would increase the revenue, the deficit by about $2.3 trillion. Then we took the growth effects into account, which are generally positive. You have higher growth, higher employment, and we found that the net effect would be $1.9 trillion. So that difference between those two things sort of gives you an idea of how much it pays for itself. If it had gone down to zero, for example, from 2.3 trillion down to zero, that would have been 100% paid for. It went down to 1.9, that's about 30% of the cost. That's how I got that number.
Right, and you said earlier, I believe you said that you did not break out those percentages for corporate tax cuts versus individual tax cuts. Is that correct?
That's right.
There's no raw figure. Do you have any sense of whether individual tax cuts paid back a higher percentage or a lower percentage, or corporate rates did one or the other?
I don't know offhand. We might be able to look at it later and give you an idea of what we think in what we did.
But the bottom line is that of the $1.9 trillion over 10 years, most of that was a cost to the taxpayers in terms of reduced revenue and increased deficits, and not an increase to the taxpayers, not a benefit.
That's right. And by the way, after a year after that estimate, we're still comfortable with that estimate. Things have come in about as we expected, so we would still say that it's about a $1.9 trillion increase in the deficit over the next decade.
All right. So is it not logical to say that increasing the corporate tax rate, if only 30% of it was paid for, would improve the deficit situation by some percentage?
We'd have to look at that. I don't want to kind of try to guess on something like that.
Well, what factors would make that not logical?
Well, on the plus side, of course, is to the degree it increases investment. You have an increase in the capital stock when you lower corporate taxes. That's sort of on the positive side, the marginal cost. But the question is, does it increase it enough that it stimulates enough growth that it pays for itself? So in the reverse, you've kind of got raising corporate taxes. Will it discourage enough investment and lower the capital stock enough that that it doesn't increase revenue? We'd have to work that through.
Okay. I'd like to see that analysis. We have a date approaching, I believe it's in March, when at least the statutory debt ceiling arrives. And while we may have some fudge room in terms of being able to pay obligations of the government past that, we still face that crisis once again. What would be the consequences of not addressing the debt ceiling in a timely manner?
I guess the thing we'd worry about is ultimately you worry about the believability of federal debt, whether or not you affect the rating of the U.S. as a borrower, that sort of thing, I suppose. I don't know that we've ever really projected what the impact would be if you missed that deadline.
All right, well, I hope you don't have to. Going to healthcare for a second, we saw the projections in your report. I think in Medicare, you're projecting about a 7% growth over the window, the 10 years. And that is based on current law, right? So if we were to, and I don't know, I can't remember exactly what the 120 suggestions were from last year, but if we were, for instance, able to, through policy, to change the law and reduce prescription drug prices by 20%, you could have a considerable impact on that growth rate. Is that not correct?
That's probably correct. We'd have to sort of look at that and try to noodle it through.
But current law does not, I mean, were there any suggestions, by the way, in terms of healthcare policy that you made in that 120 that would help reduce the growth rate? I mean, I understand part of it's demographics.
Right, right. Yeah, I haven't refreshed my memory on that. Odds are we've got some things in there because we made an effort to use proposals from committees, the things that they thought were interesting. So we try to find interesting things.
Right. When I read through your report and your testimony, one of the things that I thought was particularly frightening was all the different ways in which the situation could get worse. And not just through policy, but through economic factors, through all sorts of things. Would you say that the odds of the situation getting worse are higher, lower, or you can't tell, than that they might get better?
We actually really try really hard to make those equal. That we're in the middle. We think it's as likely things are worse, and it's just as likely things are better. To give you some idea of, it's part of our effort to sort of be objective on this. So we think we're in the middle.
And what are the possibilities? What are the worst possibilities that might occur over the next 10 years, either policy-wise? I know we're talking about the expiration of the tax cuts in a few years. I know that's a big factor. But
Right.
What would be the worst scenarios?
Well, I'd focus on non-policy things. I think our forecast with the interest rates included. Interest rates are really hard to forecast, and interest rates have a really big impact on this. And it's because we have a large debt, and the cost of borrowing is a big part of the federal budget now. And so higher or lower interest rates makes a pretty big impact on this. So I'd say that's one of the big important items.
Thank you. And one final question, and that is, we've talked about this innumerable times over the years, but how much does uncertainty as to probabilities grow the farther we go into the budget window? And obviously past that, you've got a 2049 projection as to overall debt.
The uncertainty clearly in our forecast clearly increases pretty significantly the further we go into the future. We've done some analysis of how accurate we are in projecting, and as you might expect, we're generally more accurate in a year or two than we are 5 years down the line. So that is an important thing. We try to give you a feel for that sometimes in our uncertainty chapter of how much that grows, 10 years out.
Has uncertainty increased over the last few decades, or is it about the same? Seemed to me there's a lot, the world is changing a lot more quickly than it used to.
Yeah, I'm not so sure it's in our reports so much, but it really does seem like that the level of policy uncertainty these days is higher than it has been, and that adds to, I think, to the uncertainty that we may not have captured.
Great. Well, I have no further questions. Once again, thank you so much.
Chairman.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Unanimous consent request.
Right ahead.
Mr.
Gentleman's
Chairman,
recognized.
I ask unanimous consent that a fact sheet prepared by the Committee on Education and Labor on the multi-employer crisis, the cost and consequences of inaction, pointing out that the PBGC may collapse and the revenues will go down, increased safety net spending will go up, costs as much as $275 billion over 10 years if we do nothing. Like this in it for the record.
Without objection, so done. I want to thank Director Hall once again for being with us today. Please be advised, members can submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. Any members who wish to submit questions for the record may do so within 7 days. Without objection, this hearing is adjourned.
Well done. Mr. Chair.